What happens when the person you threw away becomes someone you can't even afford to look at? For 5 years, Audrey Brown endured the shadow of her ex-husband, Mark Peterson, a man who painted their divorce as his grand escape and her tragic failure. He flaunted his new life, his new girlfriend, and his endless promotions, while publicly pitying her quiet, simple existence. Every sneer, every condescending text was a reminder of the life he claimed she wasn't good enough for. But tonight, at the city's most exclusive charity ball, the stage is set for a final, stunning confrontation. He thinks she's arrived alone, a charity case in a borrowed dress. He's about to learn that while he was busy mocking her past, she was building a future he couldn't even dream of. The divorce papers had been finalized for 3 years, but for Audrey Brown, the marriage felt like a phantom limb, gone, but still aching with a chilling permanence. Her life, once a whirlwind of corporate dinners, feigned smiles, and the constant, crushing pressure of being Mrs. Mark Peterson, had shrunk to the quiet solitude of a one-bedroom apartment overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a life she had chosen, a life of peace, but peace often felt indistinguishable from loneliness. Mark had made sure of that. He hadn't just divorced her, he'd excommunicated her from the world they had built together. He was a senior vice president at a prestigious investment firm, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ego. In his narrative, their separation was his heroic shedding of dead weight. Audrey, the quiet, bookish librarian he'd married, had become an anchor, her lack of cutthroat ambition a personal affront to his meteoric rise. He told their mutual friends she was uninspired, that she lacked drive, and that he needed a partner, not a passenger. The truth was far more painful. Audrey had supported him, celebrated his every win, and soothed his every loss. She had put her own dreams of opening a small conservatory for rare books on the back burner, believing his success was their success. The day he'd told her he was leaving, his words were cold and clinical, as if closing a bad business deal. "We're on different trajectories, Audrey. I'm heading for the stratosphere, and you're happy on the ground. It's not a judgment, it's just a fact." But it was a judgment, and it was one he continued to pass every single day, not to her face, but on the glittering, curated stage of social media. His Instagram was a monument to his post-Audrey glory. There he was with his new girlfriend, Tiffany Monroe, a woman 10 years younger, with a blindingly white smile and a job title as an influencer, on a yacht in Monaco. There they were, clinking champagne glasses in a high-rise apartment with panoramic city views. The caption reading, "Finally with someone who appreciates the view from the top." Each post was a carefully crafted dagger aimed at Audrey's heart, a public declaration that his life had only truly begun after hers had effectively ended. Audrey tried to ignore it. She deactivated her own accounts, but the stories always found their way to her through well-meaning but clumsy friends. "Did you see Mark's in Aspen?" they'd ask, or "that Tiffany seems energetic." Her life now was a quiet rebellion against the noise he created. She'd taken a job at the city's oldest public library, working in the special collections department. She spent her days surrounded by the scent of aging paper and leather, carefully restoring first editions and forgotten manuscripts. It was a world away from the sterile glass and chrome of Mark's life, and she found a profound sense of purpose in it. She was saving stories, preserving history, connecting with a past that felt more real than her own. The invitation arrived on a crisp October afternoon, nestled between a utility bill and a catalog for archival supplies. The heavy, cream-colored cardstock felt alien in her hands. It was for the annual Starlight Charity Ball, the crown jewel of the city's philanthropic calendar. It was an event she and Mark had attended every year of their marriage, a night of performative generosity and ruthless social climbing. Mark had always loved it, moving through the crowd with an easy charm that Audrey knew was a carefully constructed facade. For her, it had been an ordeal of uncomfortable shoes and conversations as hollow as the champagne flutes. She hadn't been to one since the divorce. She didn't know why she was still on the mailing list. Perhaps a clerical error, a ghost in the fundraising machine. Her first instinct was to toss it into the recycling bin. The thought of going, of seeing him there with Tiffany, of enduring the pitying glances and whispered conversations was nauseating. She could already hear his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Audrey, how brave of you to come. Are you here alone?" She placed the invitation on her small kitchen counter, a stark white rectangle against the warm butcher block. For days it sat there, a silent challenge. Part of her, a small, defiant part she thought had long been extinguished, wanted to go. Not for him, not to prove anything to him, but for herself. To walk into that ballroom, the epicenter of her old life, and know that she had survived it. To stand on her own 2 feet, in her own quiet life, and not feel like a ghost. One evening, while meticulously repairing the spine of a 19th century copy of Jane Eyre, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. She hadn't heard from him directly in months. "Heard you got an invite to the Starlight Ball. A bit out of your league these days, isn't it? Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you need help with the ticket price. I'm sure we could find a spot for you at the donations under $100 table." The cruelty of it stole her breath. It was so perfectly Mark. The offer of help wrapped in a devastating insult. He wasn't just mocking her. He was reminding her that in his world, she was worthless. Her quiet dignity, her meaningful work, her peaceful life, none of it registered on his scale of success, which was measured only in dollars and public acclaim. She stared at the text, the blue light of the screen illuminating her face in the dim light of her apartment. The old, familiar sting of tears pricked at her eyes. But then something else rose within her, a slow, burning anger. Not the hot, messy anger she'd felt in the early days of the divorce, but something colder, harder, a resolve. He thought she was nothing without him. He thought her life was a tragedy. He had built his new identity on the foundation of her supposed failure. She picked up the invitation from the counter, its sharp edges pressing into her palm. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't be a ghost in her own story. She was going to the ball. Audrey met Sebastian Sterling 6 months after the divorce, during a period she later referred to as the Great Silence. Her friends, all of whom had been Mark's first, had slowly trickled away, their invitations to brunch and wine nights becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. The silence they left was deafening at first, filled only with the echo of Mark's parting words and the phantom pain of a shared life. To fill the void, Audrey began volunteering at a local animal shelter, a noisy, chaotic place filled with the desperate, hopeful energy of abandoned creatures. It was there, while patiently trying to coax a terrified terrier out from under a cot, that she met him. He wasn't Sebastian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, the tech visionary whose net worth was a subject of feverish speculation in financial journals. He was just Seb, a quiet man in a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans who spent every Saturday morning cleaning kennels and walking the most difficult dogs. He had a calm, steady presence that the animals seemed to instinctively trust. He moved with a quiet efficiency, never seeking attention, his focus solely on the creatures in his care. Audrey noticed his hands first, large and capable, yet incredibly gentle as he calmed a whimpering beagle. He had kind eyes, a soft gray that seemed to absorb the world around him without judgment, and a faint, almost imperceptible scar that ran through his left eyebrow. For weeks they worked alongside each other, exchanging little more than polite nods and quiet smiles. Audrey found his silence comforting. It was a stark contrast to Mark's world, where every moment was filled with networking, self-promotion, and the constant pressure to perform. With Seb, there was no performance. There was just the shared, unspoken understanding of their purpose there, to offer comfort to those who had been discarded. Their first real conversation happened during a torrential downpour. They were huddled together in the shelter's small break room, sipping watery coffee from styrofoam cups. "You're very good with them," he said, his voice deeper than she'd expected. He nodded toward the kennels. "Especially the scared ones. You have a patient soul." Audrey felt a blush creep up her neck, unused to such a direct and sincere compliment. "I think they just know I understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feeling like you've been left behind? It's a language you don't forget. The admission hung in the air between them. It was more than she'd said to anyone about her divorce. He didn't press, didn't offer platitudes or pity. He just looked at her, his gray eyes filled with an unnerving level of understanding. "No," he said softly. "You don't." From then on, their conversations grew. They talked about books, about the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, about the quiet joy of walking in the woods after it rains. He learned about her dream of opening a book conservatory, and his eyes lit up with genuine interest. He asked her about the chemical composition of archival glue, about the specific type of paper used in pre-17th century texts. He wasn't just making polite conversation, he was fascinated. She learned that he was a consultant, a vague term that she accepted without question. He traveled often for work but was fiercely private about the details. He never mentioned wealth or status. He drove an old, reliable Subaru and lived in a modest downtown apartment, or so she thought. He spoke of his parents, who were teachers, and his own quiet upbringing in Oregon. He was, in every conceivable way, the antithesis of Mark Peterson. Their first date was a walk through the city's botanical garden, followed by dinner at a tiny, family-owned Italian restaurant she loved. There was no pretense, no show. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words had weight and substance. He made her laugh, a real unburdened laugh that felt like a forgotten muscle being used for the first time in years. As their relationship deepened, Audrey felt herself slowly healing. Sebastian's love was a quiet, sturdy thing. It didn't demand the spotlight. It was simply there, a constant and unwavering presence. He saw the strength in her quiet nature, the passion in her meticulous work. He didn't see her as on the ground while he was in the stratosphere. He saw her as the ground itself, the firm, essential earth from which beautiful things could grow. He never once asked about her ex-husband. He seemed to understand that the past was a wound she was still tending to. Instead, he focused on her future. One evening, he presented her with a beautifully bound book. Inside, it wasn't a novel, but a detailed business plan. The title on the cover read, "The Brown Conservatory for Literary Preservation." He had spent weeks researching, contacting real estate agents about potential locations, and outlining a financial strategy. "It's your dream, Audrey," he said, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "You shouldn't let it stay a dream." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, at this quiet, unassuming man who had seen her more clearly in a few months than her husband had in a decade. It was in that moment she knew she loved him. The full extent of his life remained a mystery, but she didn't care. She had fallen in love with Seb, the man who cleaned dog kennels and believed in her dreams. The rest was just noise. When he finally told her the truth about who he was, it was almost an afterthought, a detail he seemed slightly embarrassed to share. They were cooking dinner in her small apartment one night when a news report flashed on her small kitchen television. It was about a multi-billion-dollar acquisition in the clean energy sector. The company being acquired was Sterling Industries, and the man whose face appeared on the screen, described as the reclusive genius behind the deal, was the man currently chopping onions at her counter. She stared at the screen, then back at him. He winced, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "I should have told you sooner," Sebastian said, putting the knife down. I liked being Seb, and I didn't want that," he gestured to the television, "to get in the way of this." It took her a moment to process. The private jets, the boardrooms, the unimaginable wealth. It was all so disconnected from the man she knew. But then she looked into his eyes, the same kind, steady gray eyes, and she realized it didn't matter. He was still the same person. His wealth didn't define him, his character did. "Okay," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But the billionaire CEO of Sterling Industries is still on dish duty tonight." He laughed, a look of profound relief washing over him. In that moment, they had crossed a bridge. She wasn't just the ex-wife of a moderately successful investment banker anymore. She was the partner of a man who could buy and sell Mark's entire world without a second thought. And yet none of that felt as important as the simple fact that he loved her. The knowledge settled within her, not as a weapon, but as a shield. Mark Peterson believed in the power of a narrative. In his world, you were what people perceived you to be, and he had spent the last 3 years meticulously crafting his. He was the victor, the one who had escaped a dull, stifling marriage and soared to new heights. Audrey was the unfortunate but necessary casualty of his ascent. For his story to work, hers had to be one of failure. His mockery, therefore, was not just petty cruelty, it was a calculated campaign to reinforce his narrative. After he sent the text about the Starlight Ball, his efforts escalated, as if her silence was a challenge to his authority as the narrator of her life. The first public encounter happened a week later. Audrey was at the Daily Grind, her favorite downtown coffee shop, sketching out floor plans for the conservatory in a notebook. The bell above the door chimed, and a wave of familiar, cloying cologne washed over the cafe. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. "Well, well, well," his voice boomed unnecessarily loud. "Look what we have here. Audrey Brown, in the wild. I didn't know they let you out of the library during daylight hours." He was with two of his colleagues from the firm, smirking sycophants who had once called Audrey a friend. She felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. She kept her eyes fixed on her notebook. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice tight. "Still scribbling in your little dream journal, I see," he said, leaning over her table, deliberately invading her space. He gestured to her detailed drawings. "What is this? Plans for a new bookshelf? Don't tell me you're branching out." His friend snickered. The barista behind the counter looked on with uncomfortable pity. Audrey refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She slowly closed her notebook. "It's a business plan, Mark." "A business plan!" he exclaimed, feigning shock. "Darling, your business is books. That's not a business. It's a hobby. A cute, little, unprofitable hobby." He patted her condescendingly on the shoulder. "But you stick with it. It's important to have something to do to pass the time." He turned to his friends. "She was always like this, content with the small things. I need a bigger world." He then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I really do hope you're not planning on showing up to the ball looking to network. It's a Shark Tank, Audrey. Well, you're a goldfish." With a final pitying smile, he swept away, his entourage trailing in his wake. Audrey sat frozen, her hands clenched into fists under the table. The casual cruelty, the public humiliation. It was a masterclass in the kind of emotional warfare he had waged throughout their marriage. He didn't just want to hurt her, he wanted to diminish her, to shrink her world until it fit into the tiny box he had designed for it. The attacks continued online. He didn't tag her, but he didn't need to. He posted a photo of himself and Tiffany on a private jet, the caption reading, "On our way to close a 9-figure deal. Some of us build empires, others just stack shelves. Whatever levels, chuck and ambition, just your no ceilings." His comments section filled with fawning praise. A former friend of Audrey's, a woman she'd been a bridesmaid for, commented with a string of fire emojis. Audrey saw it on a friend's phone and felt a fresh wave of betrayal. It wasn't just Mark. It was the entire world they had shared, a world that had so easily and completely erased her. The week before the ball, a package arrived at her apartment. It was from a high-end designer boutique, a place Mark knew she found intimidating and overpriced. Inside was a dress, a simple, elegant, but undeniably last-season cocktail dress. The attached note, written in Mark's arrogant script, read, "My dearest Audrey, I know things must be tight, and I would hate for you to feel out of place at the ball. Please accept this as a gift. It's important to me that you maintain some semblance of dignity. All the best, Mark." The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a Trojan horse of an insult, a gesture of kindness designed to reinforce her status as a charity case. He was not only mocking her financial situation, but also her taste, her independence, her very right to exist in his world on her own terms. She held the dress up. It was a perfectly nice dress, but wearing it would be an act of surrender, an acceptance of his narrative. She neatly folded it, placed it back in the box, and drove it to a local women's shelter, a place where it might actually offer someone a sense of dignity, not strip them of it. That evening, she was curled up on her sofa, feeling the weight of his relentless campaign pressing down on her, when Sebastian came home from a business trip to Tokyo. He found her staring blankly at the wall, the silence in the apartment heavy with unspoken pain. He didn't say a word. He just sat beside her, wrapped his arms around her, and held her. She leaned into his solid warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing a comforting anchor in the storm of her emotions. After a long while, she told him everything. About the coffee shop, the social media posts, the dress. She expected him to be angry, to suggest some grand, retaliatory gesture. But Sebastian was not a man of grand gestures. He was a man of quiet, unshakable support. He listened patiently, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly as she spoke. When she finished, he tilted her chin up, his gray eyes searching hers. "This man," he said, his voice low and even, "he doesn't know you. He knows a version of you that he created to make himself feel powerful. The woman he's mocking doesn't exist." "It feels like she does," Audrey whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Then let's introduce him to the real one," Sebastian said. A slow, determined smile touched his lips. "You were going to this ball for yourself, to prove you could stand in that room alone. And you can. But you're not alone. So how about we go together? Let's give them something to talk about." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile broke through Audrey's sadness. The idea of walking into that ballroom with Sebastian by her side was terrifying, but also thrilling. It was no longer about survival. It was about making a statement. Not a loud, boastful statement like Mark would make, but a quiet, confident one. A statement that simply said, "You were wrong." The decision to attend the ball with Sebastian shifted something fundamental inside Audrey. The event was no longer a specter of her past to be endured, but a stage for her present to be revealed. The preparation became less about bracing for impact and more about forging armor, not of steel, but of confidence and self-worth. Sebastian understood this intuitively. "This isn't about impressing him," he told her one evening, as they looked at designer websites on his laptop. "This is about you feeling like the most powerful person in the room because you know your own value. The dress is just the uniform." He arranged a private appointment at a couture atelier run by a legendary reclusive designer named Isabella Valente, a woman known for creating art as much as clothing. The atelier was a hushed, serene space in a discreet, unmarked brownstone, a world away from the garish, logo-driven boutiques Mark favored. Isabella, a striking woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, greeted them personally. She and Sebastian spoke briefly in Italian, a warm, familiar exchange that told Audrey they were old friends. Isabella then turned her full attention to Audrey. "Sebastian tells me you are a preserver of beautiful things," she said, her voice like gravel and silk. "So tonight we will make you a beautiful thing that deserves to be preserved in memory." There was no flipping through racks. Isabella simply spoke with Audrey for nearly an hour about her life, her work, her passions. She asked about the texture of old vellum, the scent of binder's glue, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly restored spine. She was not dressing a client. She was understanding a person. At the end of their conversation, Isabella sketched for a few moments in a leather-bound book. She then turned the page to reveal a design that took Audrey's breath away. It was a gown of deep, midnight blue silk, the color of ink in a moonlit room. It was deceptively simple in its cut, a classic A-line silhouette that fell from her shoulders to the floor in an unbroken line. But the fabric was embroidered with impossibly fine silver thread, creating a subtle, intricate pattern that looked like the constellations in a forgotten star chart. It was elegant, intelligent, and understatedly magnificent. It was, Audrey thought, a dress that Jane Eyre would have worn to meet Mr. Rochester, had she owned the world. "It is strong, but quiet," Isabella said, tapping the sketch. "It does not scream for attention. It earns it." While the dress was being made, a process that involved 3 meticulous fittings, Sebastian revealed another layer of his plan. "I have a confession," he said over dinner at their favorite quiet restaurant. "I'm not just a guest at this ball. I was recently asked to join the board of the Starlight Foundation. This year they've made me the chairman." Audrey stared at him, a piece of pasta halfway to her mouth. "The chairman? Mark used to spend months trying to get a 5-minute meeting with the chairman. I know, Sebastian said with a small, apologetic smile. I tend to keep a low profile with my philanthropic work, but they were insistent. I'll have to make a short speech at the beginning of the night. He reached across the table and took her hand. And when I do, I want to introduce you, not just as my partner, but as the inspiration for my new initiative. He explained that his largest private donation of the year, a sum that would dwarf the entire event's fundraising goal, was being used to establish a new literacy and arts program for underprivileged children. It would be housed in a new wing of the city's main library, the very library where Audrey worked. I'm going to announce tonight, he continued, his voice soft with emotion, that it will be named the Eleanor Brown Wing for the Arts, after your mother. Audrey's mother, Eleanor, had been a school teacher who had instilled in Audrey her deep love of books. She had passed away when Audrey was in college, and the grief was still a tender spot in her heart. To have her mother's name, her legacy, honored in such a public and meaningful way was a gift so profound it left Audrey speechless. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was so much more than a petty revenge against Mark. This was about legacy, about purpose, about turning her quiet passion into a force for good in the world. It was the ultimate validation, not of her worth as judged by others, but of the inherent value of the life she had built. On the evening of the ball, as Audrey stood before the full-length mirror in their bedroom, she felt like a different woman. The dress fit her as if it were spun from her own skin. The midnight silk shimmered under the light, the silver constellations glowing with a subtle fire. Her hair was swept up in a simple but elegant chignon, and the only jewelry she wore was a pair of delicate diamond earrings, a gift from Sebastian that had belonged to his grandmother. She looked poised, serene, and untouchable. Sebastian came and stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking impossibly handsome, but his eyes were only on her reflection. Mark Peterson isn't going to know what hit him, he murmured, his voice filled with pride. Audrey met her own eyes in the mirror. She saw not the timid, broken woman who had signed divorce papers 3 years ago, but a woman who had found her own strength, her own love, and her own purpose. The dress was her armor, Sebastian was her champion, and the memory of her mother was her strength. It doesn't matter if he does, she said, her voice clear and steady. I'm not doing this for him anymore. She was doing it for the woman in the mirror. The Starlight Charity Ball was held at the city's historic Grand Regent Hotel, a bastion of old-world opulence with soaring marble columns, gilded ceilings, and chandeliers that dripped crystals like frozen waterfalls. The air hummed with the buzz of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. It was a sea of glittering gowns, tailored tuxedos, and surgically enhanced smiles, the city's elite on full display. Mark Peterson was in his element. He stood near the entrance of the ballroom, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, holding court. Tiffany, draped in a garish, fire-engine red dress that was both expensive and tasteless, clung to his arm, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. Mark had already spotted several key investors and the CEO of a rival firm he was trying to poach. For him, this was not a party. It was a battlefield. Just wait until you see my ex-wife, he was saying to a small circle of admirers, his voice a low, confidential boom. Poor thing. I heard she was coming. Probably got a pity ticket. I even sent her a dress so she wouldn't show up in her librarian cardigan. It's sad, really. Some people just can't handle the altitude after a fall. His friends chuckled, shaking their heads in performative sympathy. They were all part of the same ecosystem, one that thrived on the perceived failures of others. At that moment, the murmuring near the grand staircase leading down into the ballroom shifted in tone. Heads began to turn. The flow of traffic seemed to part. Audrey appeared at the top of the stairs. She paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister, surveying the room not with nervousness, but with a serene, queenly calm. The midnight blue of her gown seemed to drink the light, making her stand out in the sea of brighter, louder colors. The silver embroidery caught the light from the chandeliers, creating a breathtaking effect, as if she were wrapped in the night sky itself. She was an island of quiet elegance in an ocean of garish extravagance. A hush fell over the immediate area. People didn't know who she was, but they knew she was someone. She was not a goldfish, as Mark had called her. She was a black pearl, rare and mysterious. Mark's smirk faltered. He squinted, champagne glass frozen midway to his lips. That wasn't the dress he'd sent. That wasn't the meek, downtrodden woman he held in his memory. This woman was a stranger, a composed, radiant, impossibly beautiful stranger. He felt Tiffany tense beside him. "Who is that?" she whispered, a note of sharp jealousy in her voice. "That," Mark said, his own voice tight with disbelief, "is Audrey." He watched, stunned, as she began to descend the staircase. She didn't rush. She moved with a measured, confident grace, her eyes forward. She wasn't looking for anyone. She was simply arriving. As she reached the bottom step, a few people, mesmerized by her presence, began to clap softly, as if a royal had entered the room. Mark's initial shock curdled into a hot, possessive anger. Who did she think she was? This was his world, his stage. She had no right to command this much attention. He saw her pause at the foot of the stairs, and a cruel, triumphant thought hit him. She was alone. His confidence surged back, uglier and more potent than before. She had the dress, the entrance, but she was still just Audrey. Alone. A nobody trying to play dress up. He would put her back in her place. He would reassert his narrative, right here, in front of everyone. "Excuse me, darling," he said to Tiffany, disengaging his arm. "I need to go welcome an old friend to the party." He set his champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp click and began to move through the crowd toward her, a predatory smile spreading across his face. His friends watched, anticipating the drama, the final public act of his victory. Audrey saw him coming. She felt a flicker of the old fear, the instinct to shrink, to make herself small and invisible. But then she straightened her shoulders, the silk of the gown feeling like a suit of armor against her skin. She remembered Sebastian's words. The woman he's mocking doesn't exist. She would not let him create her again. She stood her ground, her expression calm and unreadable, and waited for him to approach. The final confrontation was about to begin. Mark glided through the crowd, his smile a mask of saccharine condescension. He reached Audrey and stopped just short of her, looking her up and down in a theatrical display of appraisal. "Audrey," he began, his voice laced with mock surprise, loud enough for the surrounding guests to turn and listen. "My goodness, you clean up nicely. I almost didn't recognize you without a stack of dusty books in your arms. Valente, isn't it? An interesting choice. A bit dramatic for a solo appearance, don't you think?" He was already planting the seeds of his narrative. She was alone, trying too hard, a pretender in a world she didn't belong to. Audrey simply looked at him, her calm gaze unwavering. "Hello, Mark. Thank you for the compliment, and thank you for the dress you sent. I'm sure it made someone very happy at the women's shelter." The polite, smiling faces of the nearby listeners flickered with interest. A direct hit. Mark's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Always so charitable," he sneered, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Giving away things you can't afford. It's a bold strategy. Tell me, are you enjoying the party? It must be a bit overwhelming. A lot has changed since your time. The minimum donation to get a seat this year was more than your annual salary." The cruelty was blatant, designed to humiliate her on every level, professionally, financially, and socially. He wanted to see her flinch, to see the tears well up in her eyes as they had so many times before. But Audrey didn't flinch. Instead, a small, enigmatic smile played on her lips. "It's a beautiful event. The foundation does such important work." Her composure infuriated him. He decided to go for the kill. He gestured around the grand ballroom at the powerful men and women networking, laughing, and making deals. "Look around, Audrey. This is the real world. A world of players, of achievers. I tried to bring you into it, but you never had the stomach for it. You chose your quiet little life, and that's fine. But you can't just put on a pretty dress and pretend to be one of us. You're a tourist here. So why don't you have a canapé, enjoy the show, and then run back to your safe little world before you get hurt?" He delivered the final line with a dismissive pat on her arm, a gesture of finality, of ownership. He had said his piece. He had put her in her place. He turned slightly, ready to walk away and receive the silent applause of his audience. "I don't think she's going anywhere." The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. It was calm, measured, and held an unmistakable authority that made every head turn. Mark froze and turned back. Standing just behind Audrey was a man he had never seen before, tall and impeccably dressed in a tuxedo that was clearly bespoke. The man radiated a confidence so profound it needed no announcement. He had placed a protective hand on the small of Audrey's back, a gesture of simple, irrefutable intimacy. Mark's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. This was an unwelcome interruption. The man's gray eyes, cool and analytical, met Mark's. "I doubt it," he said simply. He then looked at Audrey, his entire expression softening with a tenderness that was shockingly genuine. "Are you all right, my love?" Audrey leaned into his touch, her calm expression finally breaking into a warm, radiant smile that was directed solely at him. "I'm perfect." Mark stared at the exchange, a cold dread beginning to seep into his veins. "My love?" he repeated, his voice a disbelieving croak. Before anyone could say another word, the chairman of the board, a respected old-money philanthropist named Charles Covington, stepped onto the stage at the front of the ballroom. A drum roll sounded, and the lights dimmed slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles's voice echoed through the sound system, "if I could have your attention, please. It is my distinct honor to kick off this evening by introducing a man whose vision and unparalleled generosity are charting a new course for the Starlight Foundation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our new chairman, Mr. Sebastian Sterling." A wave of applause erupted, mixed with excited, shocked whispers. Sebastian Sterling? The Sebastian Sterling. He was a legend, a ghost in the machine of global finance, notoriously private and never photographed. Mark's face went completely white, his blood ran cold, and the ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked from the man beside Audrey to the stage and back again. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Sebastian gave Audrey's hand a gentle squeeze. "Excuse me for a moment," he whispered, and then he strode toward the stage, moving with the easy, unhurried grace of a man who owned every room he entered. He took the microphone from Charles, the applause swelling. The spotlight found him, illuminating the faint scar on his eyebrow and the quiet confidence in his eyes. He waited for the room to fall silent. Mark stood rooted to the spot, a statue of pure horror. Every eye in the room was on Sebastian, but Mark could feel hundreds of secondary glances boring into him. The man who had just publicly berated the girlfriend? No, the partner of the most powerful man in the room. "Thank you, Charles," Sebastian began, his voice calm and clear. "It's an honor to be here. For years, I have supported the Foundation's work from a distance, believing that good deeds are their own reward. But recently, I was inspired to take a more public role, and that inspiration came from someone who understands the power of preservation, of legacy, and of quiet, tireless dedication more than anyone I have ever known." He paused and turned, his gaze sweeping across the stunned crowd until it landed directly on Audrey. He smiled. "My wife, Audrey Brown." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Wife. The word detonated in the silence and sending shockwaves through the crowd. Mark felt the floor drop out from under him. Wife. Not girlfriend, not partner. Wife. The quiet, mousy librarian he had discarded was married to Sebastian Sterling. Sebastian continued, his eyes still locked on Audrey's. "Audrey has spent her life saving stories. Tonight, with her as my guide, we are going to start writing new ones." He then went on to announce the record-breaking donation and the establishment of the Eleanor Brown Wing for the Arts. But Mark didn't hear any of it. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The narrative he had so carefully constructed for 3 years had not just been challenged. It had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated in the space of 30 seconds. He was not the victor. He was the fool. He was the man who had thrown away a queen because he was too blind to see her crown. The moment the applause for Sebastian's speech subsided, A seismic shift occurred in the ballroom's social tectonics. The world that had once revolved around Mark Peterson tilted violently on its axis and reoriented itself around the quiet, luminous presence of his ex-wife. It was not a gradual change. It was an instantaneous, brutal realignment of power. Mark was left standing as if nailed to the floor, a statue of pure horror, as the city's elite descended upon Audrey. It was a swarm, a frantic, almost clumsy migration of the powerful and the privileged. Matriarchs dripping in dynastic jewels, who had once looked through Audrey as if she were made of glass, now pushed forward, their faces arranged in mass of delighted recognition. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, men Mark had spent years trying to cultivate, now angled for an introduction, their voices unctuously warm. He watched as Margaret Vanderbilt, a terrifyingly influential society queen whose nod of approval could make or break a career, clasped Audrey's hands in her own. "My dear Audrey," Margaret boomed, her voice carrying across the immediate area. "I always knew you had a depth that this city so rarely appreciates. That dreadful husband of yours, he never deserved you. The work you're inspiring with this new wing, it's simply breathtaking." Audrey, who could have gloated, who could have wielded this newfound power like a weapon, did nothing of the sort. She simply smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Margaret. My mother would have loved to see children have a place to discover their own stories." She gracefully steered the conversation away from herself and Mark, and towards the tangible good the foundation would do. She spoke of literacy rates and the importance of arts education, with an articulate passion that was both disarming and impressive. She wasn't performing, she was simply being herself. And in this new context, her authentic self was mesmerizing. Mark tried to move, to escape the suffocating spotlight of his own humiliation, but his feet felt like lead. He saw Tom Harrington, a colleague who had laughed the loudest at the coffee shop, now standing in Audrey's circle, nodding earnestly at her every word. Mark caught his eye for a brief second, a desperate silent plea for solidarity. Tom's face went blank. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head and immediately turned his back, engaging the person next to him in an animated conversation. The message was brutally clear. You are on your own. The final and most symbolic defection came from Tiffany. She stalked toward him, her red dress a slash of angry color against the muted opulence of the room. Her face, usually a canvas of practiced cheerfulness, was twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You idiot," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You absolute egotistical idiot. A goldfish, you called her. You stood there in front of all these people and mocked the wife of Sebastian Sterling." "I didn't know, Tiffany," he stammered, his own voice sounding weak and pathetic to his ears. "How could I have known?" "That's the entire problem with you, Mark," she snarled, poking a perfectly manicured finger into his chest. "You are so blinded by your own reflection that you can't see what's right in front of you. You didn't see her because you weren't looking. You were too busy admiring your own brilliant narrative. You didn't just misread the room. You burned the entire building down with yourself inside." She looked over his shoulder at Audrey, who was now in a deep, engaging conversation with a state senator. "She is everything you pretended to be, poised, respected, powerful. And you're a joke, a footnote in her story." Without another word, she turned on her heel and strutted away, not even bothering to collect the ridiculously expensive wrap she had draped over a nearby chair. He watched her go, realizing with a sickening lurch that she hadn't been his partner. She had been a rental, an accessory leased on the currency of his perceived status, and his credit had just been irrevocably revoked. He retreated to the shadowed alcove of a bay window, nursing a glass of whiskey he didn't remember acquiring. From this vantage point, he watched the rest of the evening unfold. He watched Audrey. She moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, Sebastian a constant, steady presence by her side. They were a unit, a silent, powerful partnership that communicated more with a shared glance than Mark had ever managed with 1,000 boastful words. His mind became a torture chamber of memories, each one a fresh indictment of his own blindness. He remembered an evening, years ago, When Audrey had shown him a business plan for her book conservatory, her eyes shining with excitement, he had glanced at it for a moment before tossing it aside. "It's a sweet dream, babe," he'd said, "but let's focus on the real world, shall we?" He remembered the light in her eyes dimming, and he had felt a flicker of satisfaction at having grounded her. He remembered her telling him, gently, that a particular investment he was excited about seemed too volatile, that she had read the company's reports and saw inconsistencies. He had laughed at her. "Leave the sharks to me, honey. You stick to your fairy tales." That investment had cost him, and the firm, nearly $1 million 6 months later. He had called her lack of ambition a weakness, when in reality, it was a different kind of strength. Her ambition wasn't for status or for wealth, but for meaning. He had spent years trying to mold her into the perfect corporate wife, never realizing he was trying to chisel a diamond with a sledgehammer, destroying the very facets that made it priceless. Later in the evening, the band began to play a slow, languid waltz. Sebastian led Audrey to the center of the dance floor. Other couples instinctively gave them space, forming a wide circle around them as if they were royalty. They danced as if they were the only two people in the universe, their movements perfectly synchronized. Sebastian murmured something in her ear, and Audrey tilted her head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. It was a sound he vaguely remembered from a lifetime ago, a sound he had single-handedly silenced. Watching them, Mark was struck by a profound and devastating understanding. He was witnessing a love that was real. It wasn't transactional. It wasn't for show. It was a quiet, unshakable fortress, and he was on the outside, peering through the bars. As the night finally began to thin, and the guests began to depart in a flurry of air kisses and valet tickets, Audrey and Sebastian made their way towards the grand entrance. Their path would take them directly past the alcove where Mark was hiding, trapped by his own cowardice. His heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't know what he wanted. A word? A look of anger? Acknowledgement of any kind that he still existed in her world, even as a villain. She saw him. As she drew level with his position, she paused for the briefest of moments, her steps not faltering. Her eyes, calm and clear, met his, and in their depths, Mark saw the one thing he had not prepared for. Not hatred, not pity, not triumph. He saw nothing, a complete and total absence of feeling. It was the detached, fleeting glance one gives a piece of furniture, a face in a crowd that holds no meaning. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of greeting or forgiveness. It was a nod of dismissal. A final, silent closing of a chapter he never even knew she was writing. Then she turned her face back towards her husband, slipped her arm through his, and they walked out of the ballroom, their receding figures framed by the grand archway. They stepped out into the cool night air, into their real life, leaving Mark Peterson utterly and completely alone in the cavernous, gilded hall, with nothing but the ashes of the story he used to tell himself. The staff moved around him, clearing glasses and snuffing out candles, their movements efficient and indifferent, as if he were already a ghost. And so the story of Mark Peterson serves as a powerful cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that a person's worth is not defined by their bank account, their social status, or the noise they make in the world. True value lies in character, in kindness, and in the quiet strength it takes to build a life of purpose, even when no one is watching. Audrey didn't seek revenge. She sought happiness, and in doing so, she found the ultimate vindication. While Mark was busy building a fragile kingdom of ego, she was cultivating a universe of genuine love and fulfillment. His world was built to be seen, hers was built to last. What did you think of Audrey's incredible journey from the shadows to the spotlight? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone completely underestimated another person, only to be proven spectacularly wrong? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story of quiet triumph and karmic justice, please don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Thank you for listening.